It started, as these things sometimes do, with the doorbell. I'd just settled back in the office chair after ferrying Wolfe his afternoon beer, which means I wasn't in the mood for uninvited guests. Wolfe was giving the amber bubbles his full concentration when the chime sounded. He tilted his head a fraction, which in Wolfe speak meant, "Archie, do something useful." I opened the door to a woman who looked like she hadn't decided whether to be bold or afraid, and had compromised by being both. She was late 30s, carefully dressed in a way that aimed at elegance but leaned toward trying too hard. A good suit, navy blue, but the gloves were worn thin at the seams, and the handbag clasp was stubborn enough that she had to fight it when she reached for a card. She handed it to me with the solemnity of a banker offering credit. "Miss Lorna Mayfield," I read, before she corrected me. "Mrs. Mayfield, may I see Mr. Wolfe? It's urgent." That word is one Wolfe has a low tolerance for, unless it's about dinner. I let her in, partly because Wolfe's eyebrows would have knitted like two caterpillars if I didn't, and partly because I was curious. She crossed the threshold like someone stepping into a temple she half believed in. When I brought her into the office, Wolfe flicked his eyes up from the beer, set it down, and leaned back with a patience that could have been carved in stone. "Madam," he said, "you intrude. State your business briefly." Mrs. Mayfield took the red leather chair opposite him and pressed her palms together. "Mr. Wolfe, I've been told you never leave this house, that you conduct everything from here. I need that. I need someone who won't step outside because if he does, it will all collapse." I could see Wolfe's lips tighten at her grammar, but he let it pass. "Proceed." She lowered her voice. "My husband, Charles Mayfield, was a financial strategist. His firm handled accounts for several prominent men in the city. Yesterday, before he left for the office, he asked me to come here and give you this." She opened the stubborn clasp of her bag and drew out a sealed envelope. I offered to take it, but she shook her head and extended it directly to Wolfe. He did not lean forward. Instead, he gestured. I took the envelope from her hand, brought it over, and set it on his desk. Wolfe studied it like it might be a poorly grown orchid. "You haven't opened it?" he asked. "No." He said if anything happened, I was to deliver it unopened to you. "Anything?" Wolfe's tone was flat. She swallowed. "Charles is missing. He didn't come home last night, and this morning, 2 men I've never seen before came to the apartment. They asked if he'd left me anything. I lied. I told them no." I leaned against the filing cabinet. The air had gone a notch tighter. Wolfe tapped the envelope with a fingertip. "And why me? Why not the police?" "My husband trusted you. He said you were the only man who could untangle what he had discovered." Her voice faltered. "I don't know what it is. But he said it might put us both in danger." Wolfe gave a small grunt that could have meant interest or indigestion. He slid a letter opener under the flap, parted it cleanly, and unfolded a single sheet of paper. His eyes moved, slow and precise. I watched his jaw muscles tighten, then relax, which was about as much drama as you'll ever see in that room. He read it twice, folded it back into the envelope, and placed it on the desk. "Well?" I asked, since Wolfe wasn't volunteering. He ignored me. To Mrs. Mayfield, he said, "Madame, your husband's note is explicit. It contains a name, a sum of money, and an accusation. If authentic, it implies an elaborate betrayal. If counterfeit, it is a crude snare. Both possibilities are equally odious." She clasped her gloves tighter. "You'll help?" "I have not agreed. Yet, Archie." He turned those eyes on me, heavy as iron weights. "There are inconsistencies," which meant my evening was spoken for. Mrs. Mayfield rose. "I'll do whatever you require. Only find him," Wolfe muttered, waving her dismissal. Your husband, if he lives, must be found. If he is dead, the manner of his demise must be established. That is not optional." Her lips trembled, but she nodded, and I showed her out. When I returned, Wolfe was staring at the envelope as if it were daring him to touch it again. He spoke, more to himself than to me. "The sanctity of this house has been disturbed, Archie. I will not allow it twice." Which, translated into English, meant case accepted. And if Wolfe had already started talking about sanctity, then somebody, somewhere, was going to regret ever crossing the threshold of West 35th Street. Wolfe didn't touch the envelope again that evening, but he had it placed square in the center of his desk, where it looked like a blot on the order of the room. When Wolfe leaves something out in plain sight, it's either a sign he's ignoring it on purpose, or he's daring the thing to blink first. With Wolfe, it could be both. He spent the rest of the evening cultivating orchids upstairs, and I spent it cultivating the gnawing suspicion that Mrs. Mayfield's husband was either hiding in a rat hole or lying in a morgue drawer. The next morning brought no orchids for me. Wolfe had Fritz deliver his breakfast upstairs while I was still halfway through mine in the kitchen. When he did finally appear in the office around 10, he lumbered to his chair, glared at the envelope, and rang for beer. He didn't speak until the glass was halfway gone. "Archie, there are 3 questions to answer. 1, why me? 2, is this document genuine? 3, what precisely is concealed in it?" 4, I said. "Where's Mr. Mayfield?" "That, confound it, is a corollary." He set the glass down. "You will begin by visiting Mrs. Mayfield's apartment. Confirm the intrusion she described and ascertain what, if anything, was sought." "Fine," I said. "And if the men come back while I'm there?" "Then you will observe. And remember, Archie, observe." That was my cue to get my hat. I called a cab and headed uptown to the Mayfield address, which was a respectable building with a uniformed doorman who gave me the once-over. He relaxed when I mentioned Mrs. Mayfield. She had me up in her apartment in minutes, the strain on her face sharper in daylight. The place looked orderly enough, but she led me to a cabinet in the sitting room. One of the drawers had been tugged half out of alignment. They went through that. Files, papers. I don't know what they were looking for. "Did they take anything?" I asked. "I can't be sure. Charles kept most of his sensitive papers in the office, but here..." She hesitated, then opened another drawer. "He had a box of letters. Old correspondence. It's gone." I bent to look. The drawer was empty. Dust lines where the box had rested. "Friends or business?" "Both." Charles saved letters. He said paper was memory. That might have been sweet, but it smelled like motive. Letters can be leverage. Letters can be dynamite. I checked the locks. Forced, though neatly. Whoever came knew his way around a pick. That suggested professionals, not amateurs. I walked the rooms, asked a few more questions, then left with nothing tangible but the image of an empty drawer. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was hunched deeper into his chair, fingertips together, when I gave him the report. He grunted when I mentioned the missing letters. "Letters," he said. "Always letters. Maybe they'll send a ransom note," I suggested. "Archie." His voice carried enough weight to squash that thought. "The letters are not ransom. They are leverage. Your Mr. Mayfield wrote this accusation not for me, but for himself. I am to authenticate what he lacked the courage or the opportunity to assert." "And you're supposed to do this without leaving the house?" His eyes narrowed. "Yes, without leaving the house." He sent me next to the Mayfield firm. I put in an appearance as a curious friend looking for Charles. The receptionist was polished and stiff, and she tried to brush me off. It wasn't until I caught the nameplate of a partner, David H. Ashcroft, that things warmed up. Ashcroft came out to see me, tall, silver at the temples, with eyes that had already measured me and found me inconvenient. "Mr. Goodwin," he said smoothly, "I know of you. and Mr. Wolfe, but I can't imagine why Mrs. Mayfield would need your services." "Neither can I," said. "Maybe because her husband's missing and two thugs tore her place apart." Ashcroft's smile didn't shift, but his knuckles went pale on the chair arm. "Charles is traveling. Business. He neglected to inform his wife, I suspect. Then he forgot his toothbrush, because he hasn't been home in 48 hours. "Really?" Ashcroft said. "How careless." He didn't offer details, but he did escort me back to the elevator with a cordiality that smelled like disinfectant. I had the distinct sense that if Charles Mayfield was hiding, Ashcroft was the one holding the closet door shut. I returned with that impression, and Wolfe listened with eyes half-lidded. When I finished, he said, "You will telephone Saul Panzer." "Saul?" "Yes. He will shadow Mr. Ashcroft. The man leaks smugness like a punctured wineskin." So Saul got the assignment, and I got stuck with errands. At Wolfe's direction, I dug into Mayfield's background, who he represented, who owed him favors, and who hated his guts. The list was longer than I liked. Among the clients were politicians, industrialists, and one opera singer famous for jewelry that shone brighter than her voice. By dinner, the brownstone was humming with suppressed energy. Wolfe had gone back upstairs with orchids, but he left instructions that I was to call him if Saul reported. Around 9, the call came. Saul's voice was as even as ever. "Your man Ashcroft met two others in a cafe on Madison. They spoke briefly. One handed him an envelope. Ashcroft didn't stay long. He went to a club after. I've got the name." That was Saul, neat, packaged, no wasted words. When I relayed it, Wolfe's eyes glittered. An envelope again. The world stinks of envelopes. He tapped his desk. "Archie, the circle forms. Tomorrow you will visit this club, learn who Ashcroft entertains. Meanwhile, we must prepare for intrusion." I knew what that meant. Wolfe might not leave the house, but when the house is breached, he takes it personally. He had me check locks, instruct Fritz on how to handle unexpected callers, and set up the office so that anyone sitting across from Wolfe would feel the weight of that desk, that globe, and those eyes. As I switched off the lights that night, I thought about Mrs. Mayfield, clutching her gloves, waiting for news of a husband who might already be a ghost. Wolfe had spoken of sanctity being disturbed. He was right. The air in the brownstone felt less like sanctuary and more like a storm waiting for the first crack of thunder. And with Wolfe, thunder didn't come from the sky. It came from the mouth of a man who never left his chair, but could still shake the walls when he chose. The next morning, Wolfe had Fritz prepare breakfast heavy enough to fortify a garrison, which meant he was planning to sit in his chair for a long, uninterrupted siege. I was on my second cup of coffee when Saul called with a neat package. Ashcroft's evening hadn't been wasted. He'd met not only at the club, but later with a woman. Soprano-level jewelry. Soprano-level ego. That fit one of the clients on Mayfield's list. Celia Montrose, the opera singer who could drown out a brass section. Saul didn't trail her home. He didn't need to. He already had the address. I relayed all this, and Wolfe drummed the envelope on his desk like it was an impatient metronome. "The woman," he said finally, "is either confidant or adversary. We must determine which." That meant me. By noon, I was standing in the vestibule of Celia Montrose's apartment, where gilt mirrors and red velvet conspired to make you feel underdressed even if you wore a crown. She appeared herself, in a robe that looked like it had been cut from a theater curtain. Her voice could have cracked glass, even without warming up. "Mr. Goodwin," she declared. "I know that name. Your employer has the reputation of a sphinx and the waistline of a Roman senator. What does he want with me?" "Information," I said. "Specifically about Charles Mayfield." Her painted brows arched. "Ah, Charles. A tragic man. Tragic because he mistook numbers for truths, when all truths are emotions." I told him so. She swept into the parlor, and I followed, careful not to step on the rug that looked too fragile for feet. "Did you tell him that, before or after he invested a few thousand for you?" I asked. She laughed, a thunderclap. "Before, during, and after. He was a clever little man, but too clever. He thought he could whisper my secrets into ledgers and keep them safe." "What secrets?" She waved a hand. "That I loved where I should not. That I owed where I should not. Such things." She leaned close, perfume overwhelming. "You tell your Wolfe that Charles Mayfield was about to betray a patron of mine. That is why he vanished." She wouldn't give more, but it was enough to sketch another suspect. A patron, money, betrayal. Ingredients for a dish Wolfe liked to season. I left Celia's palace with my ears still ringing and went downtown to chase another lead. A politician named Lucius Gruber, also on Mayfield's client list. Gruber's office was smoke and brass, the kind of place where laws are written in pencil and erased in ink. He greeted me like an old nuisance. "Mayfield," he snorted. That man was useful. Knew how to arrange things. If he's missing, he'll turn up. Men like that don't disappear. They're swallowed. "By what?" I asked. "By their own cleverness." He leaned forward, jabbing a cigar in my direction. "If he gave anything to Wolfe, burn it. Wolfe is a man who makes enemies too cleanly. Mayfield's mess isn't for him." That was a little too close to threat territory, so I smiled, tipped my hat, and departed before he could expand. Outside, I made a note. Gruber was scared, and scared men make mistakes. By the time I returned, Wolfe had been marinating in silence long enough to develop theories. He listened to my account of Celia Montrose, then Gruber, then drummed the desk again. "We now have a circle," he said. 4 points. Ashcroft, the associate with secrets. Celia Montrose, the client with vanity. Gruber, the politician with fear. And Mrs. Mayfield herself, who is either naive or complicit. 4 suspects and a missing man, I said. "That's a square, not a circle." He scowled. "Your geometry is immaterial." Just then the phone rang. Fritz answered and brought it in. It was Mrs. Mayfield, voice trembling. Someone had broken into her apartment again. This time they hadn't bothered to be neat. Drawers overturned, papers scattered, and, she whispered, her husband's photograph slashed across the face. Wolfe's jaw clenched. "Archie, go!" I went. At the Mayfield apartment, the place looked like a small tornado had been house-trained. She was pale, her hands shaking as she showed me the damage. I checked the windows. One forced. Same technique as before. Professionals again. "Anything missing this time?" I asked. She nodded, eyes wide. "Charles kept a notebook. He called it his ledger of shadows. It's gone." That, I decided, was the jackpot. Letters were one thing. A ledger of shadows sounded like blackmail in hardcover. Whoever had it would either own Mayfield or bury him. I promised her Wolfe would handle it, which meant I had just staked Wolfe's pride on a notebook I hadn't seen. Back at the brownstone, I relayed everything. Wolfe's eyes closed as if in prayer. "They escalate," he murmured. "Good. It hastens the end." "Maybe it hastens Mayfield's end," I countered. His eyes opened, cold and sharp. "Archie, that man is either dead or will be very soon. Our task is to determine who profits from either state. Once that is known, we will have him, or her, by the throat." That was Wolfe in battle mode. Motionless, but lethal. He dictated instructions for me to track Ashcroft's movements more tightly, to press Celia Montrose's maid for details, and to discreetly probe Gruber's financial ties. He even had me call Saul again, this time not to follow, but to dig. Saul would find where the money moved. It was past midnight when I finished my errands, but the office light was still burning. Wolfe sat like a carved idol. The envelope from Mayfield still on the desk, unopened since his first reading. He didn't look up when I came in, only said, "Archie, the sanctity of this house has been breached once already. It will be again. Tomorrow I shall allow it." And with Wolfe, allowing meant orchestrating. Somewhere between Celia's perfume, Gruber's cigar smoke, and Ashcroft's smugness, he had scented the real game. I couldn't see it yet, but I knew one thing. When Wolfe invited intrusion, it was because he had set the stage, and the curtain was about to rise. When Wolfe told me he was going to allow intrusion, he meant it the way a general means he's going to allow the enemy to advance one more hill before the artillery opens up. The next morning he was settled in his chair earlier than usual, the envelope squarely on the blotter, and Fritz had been told to keep the bell free of tradesmen and peddlers. I didn't need it spelled out. Someone was coming, and Wolfe was ready to let them in. The first to appear wasn't unexpected. David Ashcroft walked in at 11, all polished shoes and silk tie, carrying himself like the floor should be grateful. He was polite enough to accept the red chair, but not polite enough to disguise the faint curl of his lip when he glanced at the bookshelves and globe, as though Wolfe had furnished the office for intimidation rather than comfort. "I believe you have something that belongs to my associate," Ashcroft began, skipping any preamble. Wolfe raised one eyebrow, the kind of movement that in his world was a full-throated shout. "You presume?" Ashcroft smiled thinly. "Charles was unstable. He might have left things in odd places. If he entrusted you with papers, I'm here to collect them on behalf of the firm." Wolfe's eyes flicked to me, which meant, "Observe." I leaned against the wall, notebook out, as if I were taking dictation. Ashcroft leaned forward. "We are, after all, the rightful custodians of his professional affairs. It would be unfortunate if private materials fell into the wrong hands." Wolfe didn't move. "The wrong hands? Such as yours?" Ashcroft blinked once, but his smile didn't waver. "I'm offering to save you from entanglement," Wolfe said, which was about as close to profanity as he got. He closed his eyes. "You have come, you have spoken, and you have revealed. That will suffice. Good day." Ashcroft rose, annoyed, but he wasn't fool enough to push further. When I showed him out, he muttered, "Tell your employer that some knowledge is dangerous, and some envelopes more so." Back inside, Wolfe still had his eyes closed. "Archie," he confirmed. "He believes the envelope contains what he fears most. That is useful. Useful for Wolfe, maybe. For me, it meant more legwork. He had me call Saul to keep the tail on Ashcroft, but also told me to revisit Celia Montrose, this time not for her performance, but for her maid. I set out immediately. The maid, a nervous girl named Lillian, cracked after I promised her anonymity and hinted at a small incentive. She confessed that Celia had been seeing Mayfield privately, not for finances, but for advice on letters. Letters from a wealthy patron she wanted hidden. Lillian had once glimpsed one. The signature belonged to Lucius Gruber. That drew the circle tighter. If Gruber had written letters to Celia that Mayfield had in his possession, then the missing box and the missing ledger weren't just paper. They were dynamite. Ashcroft, Celia, and Gruber were tied together, whether they liked it or not. I hurried back with the news. Wolfe listened, lips compressed, then spoke as though dictating a recipe. "We have the 3 ingredients. 1. The lawyer who safeguards secrets for a price. 2. The soprano who barters affection for patronage. 3. The politician whose hand trembles at exposure. And the absent husband who thought to play arbiter." "And Mrs. Mayfield?" I asked. "She is either a pawn or a queen." "That remains." Before I could answer, the doorbell rang again. Fritz showed in Lucius Gruber himself, broad, sweating despite the chill, and glaring like he'd come to knock the walls down with his stare. "Wolfe," he growled, "you've got something of mine. Give it up." Wolfe's expression didn't shift a millimeter. "I have nothing of yours." "The hell you don't," Gruber snapped. He clamped his hands on the chair arms as if ready to launch himself. I tensed, but Wolfe didn't. He simply said, "If you take one further liberty in this room, I shall have Mr. Goodwin escort you out with more energy than you'll enjoy." Gruber glared at me, then back at Wolfe. "You think you can sit in this chair and dictate terms? You don't know who you're dealing with." "On the contrary," Wolfe said, "I know precisely who I'm dealing with, and I know precisely what you fear. Good day." Gruber left, slamming the door hard enough to rattle Fritz's china. Wolfe let out a long breath. "Now the storm breaks." He sent me straight back to Mrs. Mayfield. She was wan, but calmer this time, and she admitted something she'd held back before. Charles had told her that if anything happened, the key wasn't the letters or the ledger, but a name written inside the envelope. She didn't know it. She'd never looked. She begged me to tell her what it was. I promised nothing and returned. When I entered the office, Wolfe already had the phone in hand, dictating an invitation list. Ashcroft, Celia Montrose, Gruber, and Mrs. Mayfield, all to appear the following evening at his office. I asked him, "What if they don't come?" "They will," Wolfe said, "because they cannot afford not to. Each believes the envelope condemns him. Each will want to seize it or destroy it. And here they shall come, into this room, to be weighed and measured." He leaned back, eyes half-lidded. "Archie, instruct Saul to arrange the room discreetly. Our guests must sit where I wish, and the door must remain manageable." I nodded, though I didn't like the sound of manageable. When Wolfe planned a gathering, it wasn't hospitality, it was entrapment. The brownstone, disturbed once already, was about to become the stage for his kind of theater. Quiet, controlled, and merciless. That night I locked up tighter than usual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was already occupied. By tension, by Wolfe's unspoken plan, by the envelope sitting like a bomb in the middle of his desk. And if Wolfe was inviting all the suspects into the same room, then tomorrow would be the day the bomb went off. Not with fire or noise, but with words, delivered slowly and without mercy, by a man who never raised his voice and never needed to. By the following morning, Wolfe had already moved from strategy to orchestration. Fritz was instructed to polish the office like it was set for a royal visit, and Wolfe spent the better part of breakfast sketching in his head where each suspect would sit, how the chairs should be angled, and what I was to do if anyone became boisterous. That was his word. My translation: if Gruber tried to pound the desk or Celia hit a high C in protest, it would be my job to keep the roof from blowing. But Wolfe wasn't just arranging furniture. He was tightening lines. He had Saul shadowing Ashcroft and another operative, Fred Durkin, sniffing around Gruber's political backers. As for me, he had me revisit Mrs. Mayfield to gauge her mood and see if she had spoken with any of the others. I found her more controlled, though her eyes still gave away sleepless nights. She admitted Celia Montrose had telephoned her, feigning sympathy but really pressing her for details. That little gesture turned the screws tighter. Celia was probing to see what Mrs. Mayfield knew. When I brought this back, Wolfe said only, "As expected." That was his version of applause. Then he directed me to telephone Celia's maid again. Lillian hadn't lied before, but Wolfe wanted her pressed for detail, what time Celia's meetings had been, whether Mayfield had ever left anything behind, if Ashcroft had ever visited her. The girl stammered through her memory, but gave me enough. Ashcroft had indeed been seen in the building once late at night. He had carried a folder, and when he left, Celia had been in tears. That little tidbit I delivered with some relish. Wolfe took it with a grunt and lifted his hand. "We are nearly ready." Nearly ready turned out to mean that evening. The brownstone was set like a stage, the red chair for Celia, the yellow for Ashcroft, the blue leather for Gruber and the smaller armchair deliberately less imposing for Mrs. Mayfield. Wolfe himself sat behind his desk like a Roman emperor disguised as a horticulturalist, motionless except for the occasional flick of fingers. I had the duty of escorting each guest in turn. Celia arrived first, wrapped in mink and indignation. She swept past me and dropped into her chair with a flourish, as though an audience waited. Ashcroft came second, brisk and clipped, his jaw set. Gruber barged in third, already sweating, already scowling, and planted himself heavily as though daring the chair to break. Mrs. Mayfield was last, pale but composed, glancing from face to face with wary eyes. When all four were seated, Wolfe finally opened his eyes fully. "We are convened," he said. His voice was low, calm, yet it filled the room like incense. "Each of you believes you are here to recover or to suppress something. You are correct. That something is knowledge. But you mistake the form it takes. The envelope on my desk is merely a symbol. The true evidence is dispersed in letters, in accounts, in memory. And it is assembled here in my mind." Celia shifted and gave a theatrical sigh. Gruber grunted. Ashcroft's lips pressed thin. Mrs. Mayfield folded her hands tighter. Wolfe continued. Charles Mayfield knew too much, and he prepared a safeguard. He wrote a name. But before I disclose it, I shall tell you what I have learned. That was the cue for me. I handed Wolfe my notes, though he didn't need them. He began with Ashcroft, describing the night meeting, the folder, the tears. Ashcroft interrupted. "That's preposterous." But Wolfe raised a finger. "Silence. You had means to manage funds, to transfer assets, to conceal obligations, and you had reason to fear exposure." Then he turned to Celia. "You sought Charles's counsel not for investment, but for concealment. The letters you wished hidden tied you to Mr. Gruber. When you felt him slipping, you looked for another hand to guard you. You wept because you realized you had exchanged one master for another." Celia gasped, color rising to her cheeks. "Next was Gruber. You funded her indulgences, and you wrote her letters now missing. You believed Charles might use them. You feared blackmail or worse, disgrace. So you sent men to retrieve them. You failed." Gruber half rose, but I shifted my stance, and he subsided, growling under his breath. Finally, Wolfe's eyes turned on Mrs. Mayfield. "And you? You were the vessel. You brought the envelope. But were you pawn or player?" She froze, trembling, but met his gaze. "Pawn," she whispered. He nodded once. "So you say. Yet pawns can become queens." The silence stretched long enough to feel like the room was holding its breath. Wolfe let it draw, then said, "The name in the envelope is not yours. Nor yours, Mr. Ashcroft. Nor yours, Miss Montrose. It is yours, Mr. Gruber. Charles Mayfield accused you. He claimed you arranged illicit transfers through the firm, disguising them as legitimate holdings, and used your patronage of Miss Montrose as cover." Gruber went red, then purple. "Lies. He was unstable." "Indeed," Wolfe said softly. "Yet you sit here, fearing that an unstable man has doomed you. That is your admission." Celia glanced at Gruber in horror. Ashcroft's jaw tightened further, if that was possible. Mrs. Mayfield bowed her head as though the final blow had landed. Wolfe placed a heavy palm on the envelope. "This document will not leave this house. I shall convey it to the proper authorities in due course. But each of you is now measured. Mr. Gruber, you will find your career truncated. Miss Montrose, you will sing, but not for him. Mr. Ashcroft, you will learn that strategy requires ethics as well as cunning, and you, Mrs. Mayfield, must decide whether your husband returns alive or in effigy." The room broke apart after that. Gruber stormed out. Celia sobbing behind her gloves, Ashcroft stiff with rage, and Mrs. Mayfield lingering a moment as though hoping Wolfe might conjure her husband from the air. He did not. He merely rang for beer. When the door finally shut, Wolfe leaned back, sighing. Archie, the sanctity of this house has been preserved, but humanity remains intolerable. I couldn't argue. I just made a note to check the locks again, because when Wolfe invites that much thunder into the room, lightning usually follows. When the door had closed on the last of them and Wolfe had settled back with his beer, I figured the storm had passed. I should have known better. With Wolfe, the storm always circles back. The gathering had been a performance, but it hadn't been the finale. It was only the overture, and the real music was still to play. I didn't even get to finish jotting my notes before the phone rang. Saul's voice, calm and flat as ever, came through. Archie, your man Ashcroft just deposited a large sum into an account under a dummy corporation. Name traces back to a Gruber shell. I'll have the paperwork tonight. That tidbit was enough to keep Wolfe's eyes half closed with satisfaction. So they feed each other, he murmured. Ashcroft launders, Gruber consumes, Montrose adorns, and Mayfield interposed. I couldn't resist. Interposed and disappeared. He ignored me, which meant the thought hadn't left his mind. He waved me toward the phone again. Mrs. Mayfield, invite her here tomorrow morning, alone. I will test her. She came just after breakfast, subdued, her hands clasped as if she were about to take an oath. Wolfe watched her for nearly a full minute before speaking. Madam, your husband wrote my name and Gruber's in the same breath. Did you know this? She shook her head. No, he told me nothing, only that I should bring the envelope. You lie. Wolfe's tone wasn't harsh. It was absolute. She flushed. I knew he suspected Gruber. He said Gruber was siphoning money, but he wouldn't tell me more. He said the less I knew, the safer I'd be. Wolfe nodded. So you were his confessor, and now you are his widow-in-waiting. Her voice cracked. Is he alive? That, Wolfe said, depends on whether Mr. Gruber found him before or after he entrusted the ledger elsewhere. She went pale. Wolfe dismissed her with a wave, and when she was gone, he closed his eyes again. Archie, we are close. Someone tampered. Here, within these walls. I stared. Here. Yes. When Ashcroft came, when Gruber came, when Montrose came, they all had opportunity. The envelope was not safe. That was a punch in the gut. I checked the desk drawer immediately. Nothing obvious, but Wolfe wasn't talking about a missing envelope. He was talking about tampering, pages switched, names altered. I looked at him, and he nodded once, heavy. Then we need proof, I said. Indeed. Tonight. You will visit Celia Montrose again. Press her harder. She is vain, and vanity yields. So I did. I caught her between rehearsals. Her voice raw, her eyes red-rimmed. She tried to bluster, but I pressed. What had Ashcroft carried out that night? Why had she cried? Finally, she broke enough to admit it was a set of Gruber's letters. Mayfield had warned her to lock them away, but Ashcroft had taken them instead. For safekeeping. When I relayed this, Wolfe's eyes glinted. So Ashcroft hoarded, Gruber raged, Montrose cowered, and Mayfield vanished. There remains only the question of who dared to meddle in my house. For tomorrow, Archie, we shall prepare again. But this time, they will not know they prepare for their own exposure. That night, I had Fred trail Montrose, and Saul kept on Ashcroft. Both reported unusual movement. Ashcroft meeting with a man carrying a valise, Montrose telephoning repeatedly, Gruber visiting a banker under cover of dusk. It was the kind of frantic scrambling you see when the rats know the trap's about to spring. The next morning, the brownstone hummed with Wolfe's tension. He didn't pace, he never does, but his stillness had a vibration to it, like the air before thunder. He had me arrange the office again, same chairs, same placements, as if the ritual mattered. Maybe it did. One by one, they returned. Celia, with a tremor in her laugh. Ashcroft with a sheen of sweat, Gruber with a scowl deeper than before. Mrs. Mayfield, wan, her eyes darting between them. Wolfe sat behind his desk, the envelope before him, and opened his mouth. But before he could speak, I noticed it. The envelope. Something about it was off. The flap. It had been resealed, not with Wolfe's precision, but hastily, clumsily, as though someone had handled it with nerves. I stepped closer, and Wolfe gave the faintest nod. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "last night someone in this room risked entering again. The envelope was tampered with. Would any of you care to confess?" The silence was thick enough to cut. Gruber glared. Celia shivered. Ashcroft smirked, then faltered when Wolfe's gaze fixed on him. "Mr. Ashcroft," Wolfe said, "you resealed it. You hoped to replace Mayfield's accusation with another, to redirect suspicion, but you bungled. You cannot match my precision, nor Archie's eyes." Ashcroft stammered, color draining. "That's absurd." Wolfe lifted a hand. "You see, I had already copied the contents. What I hold now is not Charles Mayfield's note, but your forgery. You have convicted yourself." Celia gasped. Gruber swore. Mrs. Mayfield covered her mouth. Wolfe leaned back, heavy, immovable. "Soon, the police will have enough. The shell accounts, the letters, the forgery. It is sufficient. Charles Mayfield may be dead, but his voice endures. You thought to silence him, Ashcroft. Instead, you have amplified him." The silence that followed wasn't shock. It was surrender. Even Gruber, fists clenched, knew the tide had turned. Celia wept quietly. Mrs. Mayfield closed her eyes as if in prayer. When the room emptied at last, Wolfe let out a long, disgusted sigh. "Archie, bring beer. Humanity, confound it, is incapable of subtlety." I fetched the bottle, poured him a glass, and couldn't resist. "If subtlety's what you wanted, you should have stayed upstairs with the orchids." He grunted, took a sip, and closed his eyes. And I thought, not for the first time, that Wolfe might hate humanity, but he sure knew how to make it sing on his stage. After Ashcroft had been unmasked for tampering, the brownstone settled into that strange quiet that isn't calm, but the pause before another hammer falls. Wolfe had dismissed them with his usual finality, but I could tell he wasn't through. He hadn't delivered the coup de grace. He was holding it back, letting them twist in the wind. For Wolfe, letting a man sweat in silence is sometimes more effective than showing him the gallows. Still, I wasn't content to sit on my hands. Saul dropped by later that night, a slim folder in his grip, which he handed to me without ceremony. I flipped it open. Inside were neat copies of transactions, dates, and amounts that tied Ashcroft's hand to Gruber's pocket, all run through the shell corporation Saul had traced. Wolfe took one look, grunted approval, and closed his eyes like he'd just been handed the key to a puzzle he'd already half solved. "Archie," he said, "you will go to Mrs. Mayfield again. You will tell her, without embellishment, that her husband is dead." That knocked me back. "You're sure?" "Yes. Ashcroft's panic, Gruber's desperation, those are not the measures of men fearing exposure alone. They feared testimony. Mayfield is silenced." I didn't like it, but Wolfe's certainty was granite. The next morning I made the call. Mrs. Mayfield went white as porcelain, but she didn't break. She sat very still, then whispered, "Where?" I told her Wolfe hadn't said, and she surprised me. She nodded once as though she had expected it and murmured, "Then find him." Back at the office, Wolfe was waiting. Her composure confirms it. She knows he's gone. The question is not whether, but where. That is what will bind the noose. That afternoon, Fred rang in. He'd been keeping an eye on Gruber, who had made a discreet visit to a warehouse down by the docks. Fred followed him, and though he couldn't enter, he spotted Ashcroft arriving 10 minutes later. 2 men guarding the entrance, one carrying a bundle wrapped in canvas. Fred swore it was a man's coat sleeve sticking out. When I relayed this, Wolfe's eyes narrowed. So they have sequestered him. Alive, perhaps? Or merely the husk. Either way, it is the locus. Archie, tomorrow evening we shall summon them once more. This time, we shall end it. The day of reckoning, Wolfe was a statue. He spoke little, ate less, and spent most of the afternoon among his orchids, leaving me to wonder if he'd abandoned the whole scheme. But at 6 he descended, freshly dressed, settled into his chair, and dictated 4 more invitations, not requests, commands, each to arrive that night, again at 8. When they came, there was no mistaking the strain on their faces. Celia's rouge couldn't hide the pallor. Ashcroft looked like he hadn't slept. Gruber was wound so tight his jaw clicked when he clenched it, and Mrs. Mayfield was steady but hollow-eyed. Wolfe let them sit in silence for a full 5 minutes before he spoke. Ladies and gentlemen, the ledger of shadows is not missing. It never left this house. That hit like a thunderclap. Ashcroft lurched forward. Gruber cursed under his breath. Celia froze. Mrs. Mayfield's eyes widened. Wolfe continued, calm as a pond. Charles Mayfield foresaw betrayal. He prepared not 1 safeguard, but 2. The first was the envelope you all coveted. The second, more subtle, was a copy of his ledger. Entries coded, hidden within correspondence I hold here. He tapped a stack of letters on the desk, which I hadn't seen before. Whether they were genuine or Wolfe's own bluff, only he knew, but the effect was electric. Within these pages, Wolfe said, is evidence of every illicit transfer, every letter of indulgence, every signature of compromise. Enough to destroy careers, reputations, and fortunes. Enough to bring each of you to heel. And the one among you who tampered here, his eyes drilled into Ashcroft, has already betrayed himself. But the rest of you are not exonerated. You are bound together by this man's disappearance. Charles Mayfield is dead, and his blood is on all your hands, though one of you wielded the blade. Celia whimpered. Gruber slammed a fist down. Ashcroft opened his mouth, but Wolfe overrode him. Archie, tell them what Fred saw. I did, plain and clean. The warehouse, the bundle, the sleeve of a coat. Celia broke into sobs. Ashcroft swore denial. Gruber half rose again, but Wolfe's voice pinned him like a spear. You, Mr. Gruber, ordered his silence. You, Mr. Ashcroft, executed it, and you, Miss Montrose, abetted it by providing distraction and cover. Mrs. Mayfield, you knew, not the details, but enough, and still you brought me his plea. The room was suffocating with fear and fury. Wolfe leaned forward, palms heavy on the desk. There will be police. There will be prosecution. But before that, there will be truth. Tonight, you leave this house knowing that Charles Mayfield's voice still speaks. Through me, through this record, through the justice that will not be evaded. No one moved. No one breathed. Wolfe closed his eyes. Archie, show them out. It took some nudging, but they filed out. Gruber cursing, Ashcroft muttering. Celia half collapsed on her feet, Mrs. Mayfield silent as stone. When the door closed, I turned to Wolfe. You really have that ledger? He opened his eyes, weary, sharp. I have enough. I whistled. You've hung them without a rope. Not yet, Wolfe said. But soon, humanity, Archie, is its own executioner. I merely arranged the gallows. He reached for his beer, and I couldn't help it. That's one way to preserve the sanctity of the brownstone. Invite the devil in, then send him home with his tail on fire. Wolfe grunted, which might have been agreement, or indigestion. With him, sometimes it's the same thing. The brownstone had gone quiet again after Wolfe's last declaration, but it wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was the kind that makes you check the locks twice before bed. I stayed up later than usual, partly because I was waiting for Saul's call, and partly because Wolfe hadn't moved a muscle since the suspects filed out. He sat there with the unopened beer in front of him, eyes closed, like a man counting petals on an invisible flower. It was past midnight when the phone finally rang. Saul's voice was low. "Archie, I followed Ashcroft after he left. He went back to the warehouse, met Gruber there. They argued. Gruber shoved him, looked ready to throttle him. Then another car pulled up. Woman's silhouette. Montrose. She went in. They stayed nearly an hour. I couldn't hear much, but when they came out, Ashcroft was pale. Gruber looked murderous, and Montrose was shaking. None of them carried the bundle. I passed it on, and Wolfe's eyes flickered open. So the husk is moved. Good. They bury themselves deeper. Tomorrow the police must be engaged. That was a rare concession. Wolfe doesn't love involving law enforcement any more than he loves a cold soup, but sometimes he knows it's the only utensil available. He had me ring Inspector Kramer the next morning. I gave him the short version, skipping the embroidery. Mayfield missing, suspects circling, Wolfe holding documents that proved collusion. Kramer grumbled, cursed, and promised to look into it, which translated into he'd stomp in here within the day. He did. By noon, Kramer was in Wolfe's office, hat on the desk, jaw set. "You've been sitting on this?" Wolfe gave him a stare that could have frozen Mercury. "I have been cultivating clarity. You, Inspector, cultivate haste." Kramer barked something impolite, but Wolfe ignored it. He had me hand over the copies of Saul's findings, the financial ties, the shell companies, the hints of letters. Not the originals, mind you, but enough to prod Kramer into action. He stormed out, muttering about warrants and subpoenas. The real shift came that evening. Mrs. Mayfield returned, uninvited, her composure cracked. She begged Wolfe for the truth. "If Charles is dead, I must know where. Please." Wolfe didn't flinch. "Madam, the answer lies with those who met last night at the warehouse. You must understand, your husband played his hand and lost, but the remnants of his game will destroy the men who crushed him." Her eyes filled, but she nodded, clutching her gloves tighter. "Then finish it. For him." After she left, Wolfe turned to me. "Archie, tomorrow evening we shall end this. Arrange for all three, Gruber, Ashcroft, Montrose, to attend. Kramer will join us. He will be witness and instrument." I called Saul to keep tighter surveillance through the night. He reported little movement except Gruber making a long, tense visit to the opera house where Montrose was rehearsing. No doubt he was patching leaks. The next day the brownstone was wound like a spring. Wolfe didn't touch lunch. I had to eat both plates myself, which under other circumstances I'd call a victory. He sat immovable, eyes closed, conserving whatever thunder he was about to unleash. At 8, the suspects arrived again, ushered by Fritz one after another, Ashcroft sweating through his collar, Montrose fluttering but pale, Gruber surly, jaw clenched so hard I could hear it, and then Kramer, hulking and red-faced, dropping into a chair like he meant to break it. Wolfe opened his eyes. "Gentlemen, Madam, Inspector, tonight we conclude." He lifted the envelope, heavy fingers precise. "This, as I have said, is merely symbol. The truth is already known. Charles Mayfield is dead. His body was moved from the warehouse after Fred Durkin saw it, but it cannot be erased. And the hand that struck the final blow was not Gruber's, it was not Montrose's, it was Ashcroft's." Ashcroft lurched. "That's a lie!" "Silence," Wolfe commanded. "You feared exposure most keenly. Gruber is bluster, Montrose is vanity, but you, Mr. Ashcroft, are calculation. When Mayfield threatened to expose the shell transfers, you saw your career crumble. So you struck him, and in striking him, you sealed your ruin. Gruber may have ordered silence, Montrose may have covered it, but you executed it. And then, in folly, you tampered in this house. You attempted to replace accusation with forgery. That condemned you." Ashcroft's mouth worked, but no words came. Gruber seized on it, snarling, "I told you not to touch him. You brought us all down." Montrose sobbed into her gloves. Kramer slammed a fist. "That's enough. Ashcroft, you're coming with me. And you two, don't think this lets you off." Wolfe leaned back, satisfied. "Inspector, you will find the body not far from the warehouse, in a shallow grave by the river. They moved it last night. The traces will still be there. The rest is arithmetic." Kramer scowled, but he knew Wolfe was right. He barked for them all to stay put until his men arrived. The room was chaos. Gruber cursing, Montrose trembling, Ashcroft slumped like a punctured balloon. When they were gone, Wolfe exhaled and reached for Burr. "Archie, it is concluded. Humanity disgusts me." I couldn't argue. I poured him his glass and leaned back in my chair. "You know, for a man who hates leaving his house, you sure do invite a lot of trouble inside." He grunted, sipped, and closed his eyes. And that was Wolfe's victory. Not in the courts, not in the papers, but in the silence of the brownstone after the storm had passed. Kramer hadn't even cleared the curb when Wolfe demanded silence, which was like telling me not to breathe. But I knew the look. He wanted to let the echoes fade, to taste the air after the storm. I kept my mouth shut and jotted notes, watching him sit there with his fingers steepled and eyes half closed as though he'd been communing with the orchids instead of 3 suspects and a homicide charge. The brownstone always feels heavier after guests have been shoved out, especially the kind Wolfe summons. It's like the walls sag a little under the weight of secrets they've absorbed. Fritz padded in quietly with the evening tray, cheese, bread, and the beer Wolfe had earned. He poured, set it by Wolfe's elbow, and retreated without a sound. I finally spoke. "So Ashcroft takes the fall. Gruber goes down in the undertow. Montrose keeps her voice but loses her patronage. And Mrs. Mayfield—" "What?" "Starts over." Wolfe's eyes opened. "You recite outcomes like a market report. They are not figures. They are parables of avarice, vanity, cowardice. And the widow?" She knew enough to deliver me the envelope. "That may preserve her dignity. Perhaps even her liberty." "Not her husband," I said. He grunted. That was his acknowledgement that Mayfield was beyond reach, and the only satisfaction left was intellectual justice. Wolfe lived on that more comfortably than food, though you wouldn't know it by his belt size. By morning, the papers had it splashed across their front pages. Financier found slain in River Lot. Lawyer charged in high-profile murder. Opera star questioned in political scandal. They didn't mention Wolfe, of course. He wouldn't have allowed it. But Kramer's fingerprints were all over the Triumph, and I knew somewhere he was chewing his cigar and pretending it had all been police work. Around 11, Mrs. Mayfield returned. She wasn't trembling this time. She looked emptied out, brittle but upright. Wolfe didn't rise. He never does. But he inclined his head with more courtesy than usual. "Madame," he said. She sat, folded her gloves in her lap, and spoke softly. "They told me this morning. They found Charles where you said they would. You were right." Wolfe closed his eyes. "It is little comfort." "It is enough," she said. "At least now I know. At least he isn't lost to shadows." She rose before either of us could answer further, thanked Wolfe, thanked me, and left without another word. I watched her go, wondering if she would ever forgive herself for being half a step inside the circle that killed her husband. When the door shut, Wolfe exhaled through his nose, long and heavy. "Archie, you will close the ledger, file the copies, burn the rest." That was his ritual, tidying the battlefield. I went through the motions, stacking papers, striking a match to the scraps. The flame hissed in the grate, and with it, the remnants of Mayfield's life went to ash. In the lull that followed, I found myself thinking about the sanctity Wolfe always preached about, The brownstone as temple, untouched, inviolate. It had been breached more times in the last week than I cared to count, yet Wolfe had stood his ground. He hadn't moved an inch, and still the guilty had walked straight into his web. I said as much, leaning on the desk. You know, you ought to patent this chair. It solves more crimes than the entire homicide division. He made a sound halfway between a snort and a sigh. Nonsense. The chair is merely furniture. It is thought that convicts. Sure, I said, but you have to admit it makes a pretty good throne. He ignored me, reaching instead for his beer. After a long pull, he added, Mayfield was foolish. He believed knowledge alone secured power. He forgot that knowledge must be wielded. That omission killed him. I scribbled that down. It wasn't just Wolfe's philosophy. It was his epitaph for the man. He would never deliver it at a funeral, but it was the only memorial Mayfield would get in that office. The rest of the day passed in Wolfe's usual rhythms, orchids, books, silence. But there was a weight to it, the kind that lingers after blood has been spilled, even if not inside the house. Fritz cooked a magnificent dinner to ease it, and Wolfe did it justice. By dessert, some of the clouds had lifted. As I cleared the plates, Wolfe leaned back and closed his eyes again. Archie, remember this. Sanctity is not in walls. It is in vigilance. Once abandoned, it cannot be restored. That was his final comment, the summing up he always gave. Not a punchline, not comfort, just the distilled philosophy of a man who saw too clearly. I let it hang in the air while I wrote it down, word for word. Then I added my own note. Sure, I said, but walls don't hurt either, especially ones with Fritz cooking on the inside. Wolfe grunted, drained his glass, and signaled for silence. That was that. The case closed, the sanctity restored, and the brownstone breathing again. The brownstone had resumed its rhythms, but I could feel Wolfe wasn't done. He had pronounced the matter closed in front of Mrs. Mayfield, Kramer, and the rest, but that wasn't his final word. For Wolfe, cases don't end until he has drawn every last inference and placed it neatly in the right mental drawer. And when he keeps a drawer ajar, I know it, because he gets quieter than usual. Saul stopped by with an addendum. The police had dug up Mayfield's body near the riverbank, just as Wolfe predicted. Blunt force trauma, likely from a heavy instrument, and traces of soil under the fingernails that matched the warehouse lot. Ashcroft was cracking under interrogation. Gruber was fuming but lawyering up. Celia was clinging to hysteria like it was her last aria. Kramer had enough to keep him fed for months. Still, Saul leaned on Wolfe's desk and said, "It doesn't add up, Mr. Wolfe. If Ashcroft killed him, why drag Gruber and Montrose into it so deep?" Wolfe opened his eyes, slow and heavy. "Because, Mr. Panzer, guilt is adhesive. Men like Ashcroft cannot operate alone. They must share their crime, even if only by implication. Thus they bind accomplices who will defend them. He killed Mayfield. Gruber financed it. Montrose concealed it. Each is now fettered to the other." Saul nodded once, satisfied, and left. Wolfe let the silence swell again. I knew better than to break it, but the question rattled in my head. Something still rankled him. Something he hadn't said out loud. It showed the next morning when Fritz announced a visitor and in walked Celia Montrose. No mink, no makeup, only tremors. She wanted to speak with Wolfe privately, but Wolfe had no use for whispered sidebars. He had her sit, then prodded. Her confession spilled in gasps. She hadn't touched Mayfield. She swore it, but she admitted she'd lured him to the meeting with Ashcroft and Gruber on Ashcroft's urging. He promised her it was only to persuade Charles into silence. When she realized persuasion had become murder, she panicked. Ashcroft told her to smile, sing, and forget. She couldn't. Wolfe let her run down, then spoke with that iron calm. "Miss Montrose, you were complicit. Not in the killing, but in the enticement. The law may pity you, but it will not absolve you. She burst into tears, begged for mercy, then fled before Wolfe could dismiss her. When the door closed, Wolfe said only, "Archie, the net is tightening as it must, but the fulcrum is not yet set." I asked what he meant, but he ignored me. Instead, he spent the afternoon with his orchids, and when he returned, he dictated instructions with the precision of a man sharpening the final edge of a blade. I was to call Kramer, tell him Wolfe required one more gathering at the brownstone that evening. Everyone present, Gruber, Ashcroft, Montrose, and Mrs. Mayfield. By dusk, the office was reset once again, the familiar arrangement of chairs, the envelope squarely on the desk like a relic. Wolfe was unreadable, eyes closed until the bell announced the parade. They came, reluctant but compelled. Gruber stiff and seething, Ashcroft gray with exhaustion, Montrose hollow-eyed, and Mrs. Mayfield pale as chalk. Kramer arrived last, cigar jammed in his teeth. "Wolfe, this had better not be another parlor trick. I've already got Ashcroft dead to rights." "Sit, Inspector," Wolfe said. "Tonight we complete the geometry." He opened his eyes and let them roam over the circle. "You have all lied. Not in equal measure, but sufficiently. Mr. Ashcroft killed Charles Mayfield. That is established. Mr. Gruber financed the crime. Miss Montrose lured him. That too is established. But there is one more hand, the hand that delivered Mayfield into their reach." His eyes locked on Mrs. Mayfield. The silence swelled. She trembled. "No," she whispered. "Yes," Wolfe said. "You brought him to me with the envelope, yes. But before that, you placed him in their path. You told your husband that Wolfe could safeguard him. You urged him to prepare the letter, but you also informed Ashcroft, perhaps in desperation, perhaps in fear, perhaps even in hope of release. You betrayed him." She shook her head violently, but Wolfe's words pinned her like an insect under glass. "You did not strike him, madam, but you consigned him. You wished to be free of his shadows, his secrets, his dangers. So you whispered where you should not, and the men who circled him tightened their snare." Kramer sat forward, eyes narrowing. Gruber barked a laugh. "I told you the woman was in on it." Montrose gasped. Ashcroft buried his face in his hands. Mrs. Mayfield crumpled into the chair, sobbing, "I didn't know they'd kill him. I didn't. I only wanted them to frighten him, to stop him. He wouldn't stop. He was destroying us both." "Yet you knew," Wolfe said. His voice was low, inexorable. "You knew enough to deliver me the envelope, to preserve your alibi. Pawn or queen, as I told you, you chose your promotion." The silence after that was absolute. Kramer broke it, snapping for two men waiting in the hall. They entered, uniformed, and he gave the orders. Ashcroft, Gruber, Montrose, and finally Mrs. Mayfield. Each in turn. When they were gone, Wolfe closed his eyes again. "Archie, humanity is a tangle of appetites. Sometimes love, sometimes greed, sometimes fear. In this case, all three. Together, they strangled Mayfield. There is no mystery in it, only inevitability." I leaned against the wall, scribbling, watching him reach for his beer at last. "Yeah," I said. "But inevitability still needed someone in this chair to spell it out." He grunted, sipped, and shut his eyes. That was Wolfe's version of applause. And I decided then that if sanctity had been disturbed, it had been restored too. Not clean, not unscarred, but restored. The brownstone had that rarest of atmospheres, absolute stillness. Not the polite quiet that comes after guests leave. Not the taut silence of a room filled with waiting suspects, but the deep hush that follows resolution. Outside, the city went about its usual racket, but within those walls, Wolfe's world was once more inviolate. Kramer had left with his quarry, grumbling as always that Wolfe made things more complicated than they needed to be, though I'd noticed he didn't argue when Wolfe laid out the sequence piece by piece. Ashcroft's guilt anchored the noose. Gruber's financing cinched it. Montrose's enticement wound it tight, and Mrs. Mayfield's whispered betrayal tied the knot. The police could dress it however they liked for the papers, but Wolfe had written the epitaph before they'd even touched the body. I set about clearing the office. The envelope, empty of mystery now, went into the drawer. The chairs were returned to their places. I struck a match to the last of the useless notes, watching the smoke curl upward, carrying Mayfield's shadows away. Wolfe, meanwhile, sat with his eyes shut, palms pressed together as though he'd been carved there. When he finally spoke, it was not to me but into the air itself. The man wished to escape corruption by exposing it, yet he turned first to betrayal, then to secrecy. His wife, in fear, betrayed him again, and those who fed on his cleverness destroyed him for it. Thus his tragedy was not in dying, but in living without wisdom. That was Wolfe. Philosophy instead of eulogy. He didn't mourn Mayfield, but he pinned him like a specimen and labeled him neat and final. For Wolfe, that was the only immortality worth granting. He reached for his beer, sipped and sighed. I despise them all. They disturb my house, they desecrate my time, and they leave nothing but proof of humanity's folly. Yet it is proof, and that must suffice. I leaned against the desk, notebook in hand. You forgot one thing. He opened his eyes, heavy-lidded. What? That you got them, all of them. Gruber, Ashcroft, Montrose, even Mrs. Mayfield. You sat here, never moved an inch, and they walked right into your chair's reach. That's not folly. That's victory. He grunted, unimpressed. Victory over carrion. It is hollow. Maybe, I said, but hollow victories still count. Ask Kramer. He'll be bragging to the commissioner tomorrow like he discovered it all by tripping over his shoelaces. That earned me a faint twitch at the corner of Wolfe's mouth, which in his language was a belly laugh. He finished his beer, closed his eyes again, and signaled for silence. I didn't argue. The sanctity of the brownstone was restored. The case was closed, and Wolfe had claimed his inevitable triumph. Outside, the city could scream and clatter all it wanted. Inside, order reigned again, preserved by a man who never left his chair and a mouthy assistant who always did. And I figured, as I shut off the lights, that wasn't a bad balance. Not for us, anyway.